I have been an EMT for 11 years, and in that time I have learned to read a person by the way they move through a doorway. Some people enter a room like they own it. Some enter like they are apologizing for the space they take up. Nurse Carol Denton entered every room the same way. Straight back, eyes already moving to the monitors, badge clipped at her chest, hands free and ready. I rode beside her maybe 40 times 2 years, bringing patients into the VA on Halstead Road, and I never once thought to ask about the woman behind the name tag. I am not proud of that. I am telling you now because of what happened on a Tuesday morning in late October in the rehabilitation corridor on the second floor in front of 15 men who had earned the right to know a soldier when they saw one. She had worked a double. That was the first thing I learned after the fact. She had come on at 6 the previous morning, covered a colleague's overnight, and was still moving at 7:45 the next day when I rolled a gurney through the bay doors and saw her leaning against the corridor wall with her eyes closed. I thought she was resting. I had seen nurses steal 30 seconds against a wall before, but the color of her face was wrong, and when I called her name, she did not answer right away. And when she did answer, her voice had the flat quality of a person running on nothing. I'm fine, she said. She said it the way soldiers say it. I know that now. I flagged the charge nurse, a man named Patterson, who had been at that VA longer than anyone, and who managed it the way a tired man manages a leaky boat, patching what he could and ignoring what he couldn't. He glanced down the corridor, noted she was still upright, and told me she had a history of pushing too hard and that she knew her limits. He said it without malice. That was somehow worse. He went back to his station, and the corridor went back to its ordinary noise, the squeak of a cartwheel, the murmur of a television from one of the rooms, the PA system calling a name nobody rushed to answer. I stood there a moment, watching her breathe against the wall, and then I did what I had always done. I moved on to my paperwork and left her to it, but I did not leave the floor. I had a patient to hand off on that wing, and while I waited for the receiving team, I sat in the corridor and watched. What I saw, I had been watching in pieces for 2 years without ever assembling it into a picture. Sergeant First Class Roy Aldridge was in the room at the end of the hall. He had come back from his third tour with damage that the charts described in language I only half understood. Nerve damage, traumatic brain injury, a right knee rebuilt twice, and something that the intake team had written as severe adjustment disorder, which was their careful way of saying that Roy Aldridge had stopped trusting the world to be survivable. He had been at Halstead for 6 weeks when I first started bringing patients to that wing. He did not speak to the physical therapy staff unless cornered. He had refused occupational therapy twice. He had a way of watching the door that reminded me of a man expecting bad news to walk through it. Every nurse on that floor had tried. Most of them lasted 3 or 4 sessions before Aldridge's silence wore them down, and they handed him to someone else. Patterson had noted in the chart that the patient was resistant to engagement and left it at that. Carol Denton did not try to engage him. That was the difference. I had watched her go into that room a dozen times, and not once did she arrive with the careful, cheerful energy that the other staff deployed like a shield. She arrived the way she arrived everywhere, straight back, eyes moving, hands ready. She would check his vitals without commentary, adjust the IV line with a precision that was almost surgical, and then sometimes she would simply sit in the chair beside the bed and read the clipboard notes without speaking, not performing calm, just being it. I watched Aldridge watch her hands. There is a way that men with combat experience observe the hands of someone working near them. It is not suspicion, exactly. It is assessment, the unconscious reading of whether a person knows what they are doing under pressure, whether the hands will hold steady when the situation stops being routine. I had seen it in veterans during transport, the way they tracked a paramedic's movements with quiet professional attention. Roy Aldridge watched Carol Denton's hands the way I have seen veterans watch each other, measuring competence the way the rest of us measure weather. And somewhere in those weeks, something shifted in him. He began to answer her questions with more than one word. He began to eat the meals she left without her having to note it in the chart. Once, when I was in the corridor late on a Thursday, I heard him say something through the half-open door that made her pause, and then respond in a voice too low for me to catch. And when she came out, she did not look triumphant. She looked tired and careful, and like a person carrying something that she had been carrying for a long time. I did not ask. That is the second thing I am not proud of. So on that Tuesday morning, I was sitting in the corridor doing paperwork when I heard the sound, not a crash, but a controlled folding, the sound of someone who has learned to fall without making a scene. I looked up, and Carol Denton was on one knee in the hallway, her hand on the wall, her eyes still open. her badge swinging on its lanyard where it had swung loose when she went down. I was on my feet before I thought about it. Two other nurses appeared from the station, Patterson's, and came around the corner with the expression of a man already calculating liability. Someone said her name. She was conscious. She said she was fine again. She began to push herself upright with the mechanical determination of a person who has been told she cannot stop. And then the door at the end of the corridor opened. Roy Aldridge had not stood without assistance in 3 weeks. The physical therapy notes were clear on that. The right knee, the nerve damage, the risk of a fall. He stood anyway. He had his hand on the doorframe and his jaw set in a way that I recognized from somewhere I could not immediately name, and he moved into the corridor with the slow, weight-bearing focus of a man who has decided that this is worth the cost. Patterson started toward him. Surgeon needs you need to. Aldridge did not look at Patterson. He looked at Carol Denton. He crossed the corridor in 6 steps that must have cost him something I cannot measure. He lowered himself to one knee beside her, careful, controlled, a soldier choosing his ground. And he picked up her badge or it hung loose from the lanyard. He turned it over. I could not see what was on the back of it from where I stood. Later I would learn what he read, a line engraved into the metal in small capital, letters worn smooth at the edges, the kind of engraving a soldier puts on something she plans to keep. The motto of the 782nd Forward Surgical Team, 6 words in Latin that translate roughly to, "We hold the line where others cannot." Aldridge read it. He went still. He looked at her face. "Denton," he said. His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before. Not soft, exactly. "Certain. Camp Sharana, 2012. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Wardak, 2013. Something passed between them that I was not equipped to read. He nodded once, the way soldiers nod when the accounting is finished. "You held that aid station alone," he said. It was not a question. She did not answer. She did not need to. Aldridge turned and looked down the corridor. There were men in doorways, other patients, drawn by the sound of movement or by some frequency of attention that people who have been in combat seem to share. 7 of them in wheelchairs, 4 on crutches, 2 who had been walking the corridor in physical therapy and had stopped. They were all looking at Carol Denton. Aldridge said, in a voice that carried, "This woman is a decorated combat medic, 3 tours, Bronze Star with Valor. She held a forward aid station in Wardak Province for 6 hours with 2 surgeons down, and she brought every man on her table through it." The corridor was quiet. Then one of the men in the wheelchairs, an older veteran with a prosthetic left arm and the flat, unhurried bearing of someone who has been saluting since before I was born, placed his one hand on his knee and pushed himself to his feet. He stood at attention in the corridor, chin up, eyes forward, the way men stand when they are in the presence of something that has earned that particular silence. The others followed. Not all of them could stand fully. Some straightened in their wheelchairs with the effort showing in their faces and not caring that it showed. One man on crutches adjusted his weight and brought himself upright with a slow deliberateness that made my throat close. They did it the way men do things when the doing matters more than the ease of it. Patterson had gone very still near his station. Carol Denton looked at the row of them. She looked for a long time. Then she straightened her badge on its lanyard and clipped it back to her chest. And she said quietly, "Thank you, gentlemen," and nothing more. I drove back to the station that morning, and I sat in the vehicle for a while before I went inside. I thought about 11 years of corridors and doorways and people I had moved past without asking. I thought about a woman leaning against a wall with her eyes closed who had carried something no one around her had thought to see, doing the work the same way regardless, because that was the kind of person she was. Roy Aldridge was discharged 6 weeks later, walking on his own, shaking her hand at the bay doors in the cold morning air. He said something to her that I could not hear. She nodded once, the way she nodded at everything, level, certain, enough. I thought about asking her what he said. Instead, I held the door.